Hiya lovelies, welcome to my rosé reading wrap up for July, where I pour a little glass of rosé and as a rose, I talk you through all of the books I read in the past month. First things first is the rosé. Now disclaimer, if you're underage wherever you live, whatever the age of drinking is where you live, please do not drink along. But if you are over the age where you are allowed to drink legally wherever you are from, go grab a little glass of rosé along with me. A tequila shot is also acceptable. Or maybe you're just going to not drink and have a little Diet Pepsi if it's your preferred choice like me because it's superior to Diet Coke. A little tea, a little coffee, whatever tickles your fancy really. But I am treating this like a boozy book club. Now, did I buy an electric wine opener? Yes. Is it honestly one of the most fun little gadgets I own? Honestly, yes. Ordinarily, I would put lip gloss on for this, but since that would just all end up on the rim of my glass, we aren't going to do that today. Let's get into some statistics quickly before I delve right into the giant, honestly, mountain of books sat beside me. We read 10 books this month that are going towards our reading challenge. We had 3 rereads of books I've already read this year, 1 DNF, and then 1 book that I am currently reading. Honestly, it's been a pretty good reading month this month. I read some books that I was highly anticipating, like Releasing 10. I finally got round to that one. And then I also read new releases like Glorious Rivals. And according to my notes, which I am looking to quickly, it brings our page total for what we read this month to 4,799 pages. That is just for the books that I'm counting towards my reading challenge because I got that statistic off Storygraph, and that's only the books I'm obviously counting towards the challenge. But with my rereads that I haven't counted, I have read a few more pages. So to clarify, obviously every book that I read for the first time gets counted towards my reading challenge. Then, if I'm rereading a book that I haven't already read this year, it also gets counted. But if I'm rereading a book I read earlier in the year already, only that earlier reading in the year counts. I don't count books twice if I've read the same book twice in a year. So with that all done, let's take a little sip of wine and delve right into it. Cheers, my lovelies. So we're going to start with my rereads because I just want to fly through those very, very quickly. Now, I said in the intro I had 3 rereads. I actually have 4, but one of them did get counted towards the 10 books towards my reading goal. That's why I didn't mention it in the rereads total. Now I'm going to lump 3 of my rereads all together because that is Icebreaker by Hannah Grace, it is Deep End by Ali Hazelwood, and then it's Heartless by Elsie Silver. These are the books I'm reading and writing about for my dissertation at the moment. We're talking about gendered sexual stigmas and how to write for the female gaze in terms of sexual content. So I closely analysed the sexual content of these 3 books, which is really quite fun actually. Writing a dissertation at the master's level is essentially me, the lineage of the romance genre, looking at book talk and book talk romance as a subgenre of romance itself, and closely analysing sex scenes. Sometimes academia is really unserious and really fun. Icebreaker is the one of these books that did go towards my reading goal because I originally read this previous to this year. Now, I know a lot of people have a lot to say about Icebreaker and they think it's essentially porn in a book or it's all just about the smut, but what I really like about Icebreaker and the Maple Hill series in general is the fact that outside of the sex and the romance itself, we deal with some more complex issues. We aren't just looking at romance, sex, and then the sports because it is a sports romance, but we're also looking at body image, disordered eating, and how that relates to being a high-level athlete. We're looking at found family and complex family dynamics in all different senses of the word. Yes, we can make comments about the fact that the pacing of the plot in this book definitely could do with some work, and I do think that's just something that got ironed out with practice throughout the rest of the series, but I'm not talking about the rest of the series, I'm just talking about Icebreaker. At the end of the day, I think it gets a bad rap for just being sexual content when there is a lot more depth to this. But I might just be biased because I am spending a lot of time with these books at the moment. Next, we're talking Deep End by Ali Hazelwood. I did read this originally earlier this year when it came out, and that's how I decided it was going into the dissertation, but we reread it with all of the highlighting going on so I could analyse it. Now, this is another book that I know people have their thoughts about when people heard this was going to play a little bit more into BDSM and power dynamics. I know a lot of people were expecting more from it and more from those sex scenes. I actually have an opinion that perhaps that comes a little bit from the fact that through pornography and through dark romances, things that are part of the kink community, acts and dynamics, all these things have become a little bit more mainstreamed, and people don't necessarily consider the safe, sane and consensual practices that need to happen around them to make them safe, sane and consensual. So the negotiation about even the most seemingly simplistic aspects of a sexual power dynamic within this book and the importance of that, the importance of consent, I thought were great. Maybe more so than the sex itself, I think the conversations around sex in this book are what I want to see more of. Talking explicitly about consent, talking about desires and not shying away from sharing those things, so that not only can everyone kind of have their needs met, as it were, but so everyone involved can feel like they can voice their opinion and that this is almost a safe space for them. By having this very strong and capable main character in the female main character, we're able to see that this sexual submission and dominance comes down to trust. That's where the power lies. The power's not actually in the dominance of the thing, it's in the trust that happens in that dynamic, and that is what I liked about this book. And then the final book of my dissertation, we have Heartless by Elsie Silver. Now, this isn't actually my favourite book of the Chestnut Springs series, but I know it is a lot of people's. My favourite would probably be Powerless, but I can see the appeal of this book. We have a very strong, very physically capable man showing a lot of tenderness around how he takes care of both his son and Willa throughout this. He's not just showcasing that he can provide, but that connection is there as well, and that true care. He's not just working to provide for his son, he's cooking dinner with his son, and that's something he looks forward to and cherishes. He isn't just caring about Willa's safety because she's looking after his son, but he holds her hair back at arguably one of your lowest moments when not everyone would like to see you when you're throwing up. Those are the caring and tender moments that I think are actually where the attraction comes from towards Cade in this book. I like to think it's protection without being controlling, and it's caregiving in an immersive and kind way. So actually the relationship dynamic in this is what's most interesting to me. Can you tell I've been analysing those books closely? Because I tried to be brief about that. Now, the final reread was The Grandest Game by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This is the first in the Grandest Game series. I believe so far we know there's going to be 3 books. It's not a spin-off, but it's a continuation series of the Inheritance Games world. So you have to read the Inheritance Games before you read this, otherwise you won't understand the world at all. It does continue some of the people and politics of the world contextually around it, but what we're actually focusing on specifically plot-wise is this idea of the Grandest Game, which is an annual game that Avery Graham, who inherits Tobias Hawthorne's millions, maybe even billions, in the Inheritance Games, puts on every year, where there's a cash prize. So you have 7 players playing against each other. We follow 3 different perspectives in here. We have Gigi, who is Grayson's half-sister. We have Lyra, who is kind of a new character. We've heard her voice briefly in phone calls in previous books, but Lyra is largely a new character to us. And then we have either, I'm not sure whether it's pronounced Rohan or Rowan, because I've heard both, but that is a character that we met in the Brothers Hawthorne in terms of the Devil's Mercy, and actually is a character that I came to like a lot more by being inside his head here, rather than just seeing the persona of the character previously. I believe how I put it on Goodreads is this has everything that the Inheritance Games has in terms of solving riddles and puzzles, mixed with a little bit of Caraval as well. So that's the rereads, but the reason I reread The Grandest Games is because Glorious Rivals by Jennifer Lynn Barnes came out this month, and this is book 2 in the Grandest Game series. It's a little bit thicker and there's a little bit more complexity going on in here. So this is the one where we definitely see a lot more of that related content back to the Inheritance Games. And this is what Jennifer Lynn Barnes does brilliantly for me. Not only is there the direct puzzles and riddles that are laid out in front of you that you're trying to solve in here, but the real puzzles are how everyone's connected. The people are the puzzles and the politics of the people who knows who, how do they know each other, who's done what in the past. All of that is the interest. We connect back to some of the looser ends of the Inheritance Game series really nicely. We see Grayson's perspective introduced alongside the other three in here as well, but that allows us to have more of that outside Hawthorne perspective that brings in the context from the Inheritance Games. And I actually think it didn't overload the story, which was my fear after reading the three perspectives of the first one. And ultimately, I am on the edge of my seat for the next book because I didn't know there would be one, and I can't find it listed on Amazon, but in the front of this book, it lists there being another The Grandest Game series book. So I'm excited. And if you haven't picked up this series, I really think you should. I also will have at some point in the coming weeks a 24-hour readathon vlog that does feature those Grandest Games books, so keep an eye out for that. Now, little wine break after the rereads before we get into the others. I'm not going to do this chronologically because we're going to first move on to Releasing 10 by Chloe Walsh. This is a book that I actually read really near the end of the month of July, but the reason we're moving on to this first is because this is probably going to be the heaviest section of what I'm talking about in terms of content of these books, but it's also perhaps the place where I have the most complex thoughts. So we're going to pop it in here before we can then move on to lighter things. I did forget to say, and yes, I look the same because I just finished filming and I'm starting editing right now, that some of what I'm talking about in Releasing 10 is likely to be spoilers, either for this book or previous books in the series, so I can actually talk about the controversies around the content. So if you don't want to be spoiled on this book, if you haven't read it, I have put chapters on this video for each book I'm talking about. Just skip to the next one, because I am going to talk about Releasing 10 for quite a while. There's a lot of content to talk about, but obviously feel free to skip ahead, especially because this one talks about some heavy topics. So I actually read the ebook version of this one purely because it's a very, very thick book, although you wouldn't necessarily think that with how quickly you can get through it, and part of that is because Chloe Walsh has very digestible writing. In some ways, yes, I've heard people say it feels like Wattpad writing, and I do understand that to a certain degree, but it makes it very, very digestible. And with these longer books, I do think that's a merit to it. Before I talk too much about delving into this book specifically, I do want to briefly mention that there are some controversies surrounding this author and the Boys of Tommen series more widely. The controversy around Chloe Walsh and all of this, I'll be perfectly honest, I'm still trying to understand. When I first came to the Boys of Tommen series, I didn't know there was a controversy around the author at all. I didn't actually do a lot of research around the author. I saw clips about this series, specifically relating to Joey and Aoife's books, which are Saving and Redeeming 6, and I was pulled in. To me, this book series is addictive, but it also speaks to a very specific version of me that I carry with me at all points, and it's the people I knew in that point in my life, the people I literally had loved, who I see reflected in a lot of the characters in these books. And this is a book series that I think 17-year-old me kind of needed. So that's the reason I was drawn to this series. So whilst I'm in the process of investigating that, all I can really urge you to do is research on your own. But the reason I just still want to talk about Releasing 10 in this video, and I'm not holding off from talking about it, is because I've seen a lot of people talk about the content of this book as well, and that is what I'm going to touch on in this video. The first thing I will say about reading Releasing 10 or any of the Boys of Tommen books is look into trigger warnings. This is a heavy series, and yes, it's a series that focuses young people, but there are literal warnings in the front of these books that they may not be suited for younger readers, that they deal with very, very heavy topics. And some people think perhaps they don't belong in narratives surrounding young people. I think saying that does a disservice to the realities that some people definitely do face. And in response, I've heard to some of the backlash to Releasing 10 and the content, which involves things like child sexual assault. It involves a lot of mental health representation. I can see why some people would not want to read the content of this book. And I think it comes back to whether books are just for entertainment. I'm a big believer that not all literature is meant to comfort. Sometimes it's meant to make you uncomfortable so you can reflect on the realities of a situation. And I do think that's the intent of a lot of this book. But that is why I say, please check out trigger warnings, check out whether this book and the entire series is something you are able to handle. Because I know me, I put off reading Releasing 10 for a little while because it's a very heavy book and I wanted to be in the right place to read it. So look after yourself and safeguard your well-being going into these books. So speaking specifically to the content of Releasing 10, I think there's a really interesting and important conversation we can have here. There is something very, very harmful, and we're showcasing it in this book, about not providing children with language, not listening to children, and not validating their experiences so that they will communicate with us when negative and harmful things happen to them. And if we don't validate their experiences, if we don't listen to them, we can't get to the bottom of what's actually happening, because Lizzie literally displays a very childlike understanding, which often is not seemingly placed in reality. Because if a child doesn't have a reference point in their actual reality for what's happening to them, it will become like a fantasy in how they present it, because often horrors are only presented to them in the world of monsters, in fairy tales and stories, so that's how they will depict it back. And we have to provide language, we have to provide tools, and we have to listen, because Lizzie wasn't listened to all of this book. That's what the commentary is telling us within this. The harm that stigmatizing mental illness does, and the harm of not providing children with language, listening to children, and validating their experiences. This book also showcases, I think, how children's brains process trauma really well. Like I say, if they don't have a reference point in their reality, they will produce a type of fantasy world or a story surrounding that trauma to try and understand it themselves, especially when they're being told it's not real by people around them. That childlike understanding of trauma within Lizzie, I think that's very well explored. However, on the flip side, I do think some of the vocab and words given to these kids, especially in the dialogue, isn't necessarily that representative of their age range. However, Huey wanting to help Lizzie and trying to grasp an understanding of what's happening to her at the age of, I think, around 10, isn't that unrealistic. Young people, we like to think, don't have to come to terms with these things and form an understanding at that age in terms of what the realities of mental health and some of the darker parts of life. But the reality is, at 10 years old, I was coming to terms with some mental health stuff that still walks with me to this day. It's not unheard of that young people not only experience but do have to come to understand these things, and it's not something they're incapable of either. And I have seen some people perhaps suggesting that's not how young people would act, that's not a reality, and it is. It may not be everyone's reality, but I don't think it's unrealistic to portray. Another big thing I've seen people talk about in this book is the fact that how child sexual abuse is depicted differs in this narrative compared to past narratives. Some people say that's favoritism of characters, some people say that's Chloe Walsh trying to redeem Lizzie's character a little bit more. But when we break it down, what's being showcased is two different approaches of dealing with trauma and two different relationships to trauma. So previously we've seen the horrors of living with trauma that you can't communicate to others, whereas Lizzie almost shows the lack of awareness and repression of trauma. Neither one is being depicted as worse than another. We aren't playing the Olympics of who has it worse. It's not the Trauma Olympics. But their relationship to trauma is different. And that's important to acknowledge, that everyone's relationship to trauma, even if it's similar trauma, is different. But I think this book provides a lot of context that we're going to need in that second Gibbsy and Claire book surrounding the Lizzie-Gibbsy dynamic. I will say, what felt like a gut punch to me in this book, and it's also what was the gut punch for me with Joey and Aoife, is the toll that dealing with mental health can take on young people in relationships. Again, because I relate to it, right? I've been that person who lays awake at night thinking, is today the day I get the phone call? I've been the person who stays up convincing someone to stay. Weighs on you and it looms over everything you do, even though you may love and care for a person, eventually it does weigh you down, and you have to put your own oxygen mask on first. I can't address everything in this video. Do your research, check your trigger warnings, research the author, and make your own decision. I am in the process of trying to understand all of the nuances so I can make my own decision on the author. But this book series, if you're in a good enough place to do it, even if you don't want to buy them outright, if you buy them secondhand, I do think there's a lot of important social commentary going on within them, and they represent a lot of young people's realities, even if they weren't yours. So that's important to understand and read about and know. I'm going to stop talking about Releasing 10, and we're going to zoom through the other books now. Let's have a quick wine break, everyone. I think we have earned it. Moving on to a cozier murder mystery kind of vibe, we have the third and fourth book of the Thursday Murder Club series. Honestly, this whole series is so much fun. It's such a cozy read. I honestly think going into autumn, this would be a great series to pick up. Like I say, this is the third and fourth book, so I don't want to spoil too much. What I will do is tell you a little bit about the series as a whole. So this is a series that focuses on 4 friends who live in a retirement village. It's the first time I've actually read anything about protagonists who are in that older age demographic, and I really, really enjoyed it because they are written so vibrantly. And I'm not just talking about their backstories and the lives they once lived, but they are still as vibrant and colourful and quick-witted as ever. They are a great collection, if a little bit unlikely. So we have Joyce, Elizabeth, Ibrahim and Ron, and they are the members of the Thursday Murder Club. Every Thursday they meet up and they try and solve old murder cases. It just so happens that murder cases show up at practically their front doorstep, and they get involved in solving active cases. Now, we meet a lot of characters throughout this series. Some of them stick around only for one book, centering one case, because each of the books looks at different cases. Sometimes they join along with the crew going into subsequent books. I will say towards the end of the series thus published, sometimes we do get the issue of there's too many characters to properly differentiate them, and they just become plot devices rather than fully fleshed out characters. I'm hoping that's something we see rectified because a 5th book is coming out in September. And whilst they're a murder mystery, they aren't overly gory or graphic. They still feel light-hearted and there's a good humour in them, which is why I think these are a great cozy autumnal read. Next, I want to talk about Emily Henry. These are actually the first Emily Henry books I've read, and honestly, Emily Henry is now an auto-buy author for me. I started with People We Meet on Vacation, which I think is now called You and Me on Vacation. They had both titles with this cover, but I knew it as People We Meet on Vacation, so I picked this one up. I believe this is being made into a movie as well. I had a whole little chat with the cashier at Topping and Company about it. I honestly flew through this. So this is about Poppy and Alex. They are best friends. They met 12 summers ago. Well, they met in college at orientation, but they didn't officially become friends until 12 summers ago when they carpooled home from college. And ever since then, every summer they go on a trip together. That was until 2 summers ago where everything went a little bit wrong, and now Poppy, who is a travel writer by trade, she's desperate to recapture the magic they once had, so plans this trip under the pretense of it being with work to get Alex to come along on a trip with her one last time. And she's trying to save the relationship they have in their friendship. She's trying to rekindle something there. I love Emily Henry's writing style. There's enough nuance that it doesn't feel surface level while still feeling fun and easy to digest. There's some real depth to the characters. This one especially, there's a little bit of a look at burnout. We're talking about not just desires in a relationship in here when it comes to the romantic aspects, but also communication about personal fulfillment and how you have to find that both outside of your relationship before you can enter a healthy one, but also continue to find it whilst you're in a relationship. The relationship can't be your whole life. There's some really good discussions and topics within this novel with some really fun characters. And that is definitely a marker of Emily Henry's writing style, because that carries on in Funny Story as well. This follows Daphne and Miles. Daphne was engaged to Peter, who calls off their engagement to get with his best friend, his childhood best friend, who just happens to now be Miles's ex. with nowhere to stay anymore, Daphne moves in with Miles, and they RSVP to Peter and Petra's wedding as going as a couple. So it's fake dating, but does it become more? Again, there's narratives of fulfillment within here. What I really loved is the chemistry is great, the communication is also great, and the humour is all-encompassing. This was actually a 5-star read for me. I really, really enjoyed it. I thought the characters were really dynamic and fun. Like I say, the chemistry and connection was written really well. And Emily Henry's writing style is one I think I really get on with. She is officially an author for me. While we're on the topic of romance, this is Heart-Wrenched by Kate Crew. This is the first book in the Hollow's Garage series. Now, is this the best written thing in the world? No. But is this such a guilty pleasure read? Yes. I read this literally in one sitting. I think I read this over the course of about 3 hours. So in here, we follow Quinn, who is a struggling college student, and Ransom. He is a mechanic. He also is known to do a little bit of street racing on the side. And Quinn claims to hate Ransom because of them going to high school together. Little do we know that they both actually have a thing for each other. It is a romance. There's found family in here. It's supposedly a little bit enemies to lovers, but they never actually hated each other, and we can tell that from the moment they meet. Ransom has the ultimate bad boy thing going on that, let's face it ladies, we all fall for and we all love. I ordered this right after I'd finished Motorhead's on Prime Video. It fulfills that little Motorhead Fast and Furious itch, like the first Fast and Furious, where they're all living in the house together and they're drag racing. That's the vibe of this. You can definitely tell it's an indie author because there are some clear editing and copy editing mistakes that definitely could do with some fixing, and the writing style at times felt a little bit stunted. The characterization didn't feel the most consistent, but the chemistry in this is amazing. I think the author has a lot of potential, and I do plan to continue on with the series to see if we see that improvement from the author. Also because guilty pleasure read. We all need one of them. Next up we have Deep Cuts by Holly Brickley, which I had such high expectations for, and honestly it fell a little bit flat. In here we follow Joe, who is a musician, and Percy, who is kind of his muse/critic who helps him improve enough to make it a career. The synopsis makes it sound like we're going to follow Joe and Percy throughout this whole book. We don't really. It's really a character study of Percy, which I enjoyed, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of complexity about the character of Percy that's explored, especially surrounding growing up and finding your purpose. There's a lot of interesting commentary on songs and music and relating songs and music to your own emotions and things going on in your life. And this falls on the right side of litfic for me. Sometimes you feel in litfic that the author is trying to prove they're good at their craft so much that they end up borrowing too much from the literary greats. This doesn't do that. The writing style is really strong in this. It is lovely and descriptive and introspective without getting bogged down. It's really fun to engage with, even to the point that instead of a load of exposition about Percy, her childhood and her relationship to music, we get a drafted and rewritten zine article that provides loads of different little story snippets about her as a young child. But it's wrapped up in this trying to draft and redraft a written piece of work. It's not just talking straight to the reader, it's serving a plot purpose. It was crafted very, very well. I think it could have done with being longer. This is a very short book. It's 200 and something pages. It's 271 pages. The ending felt very rushed. Joe is literally absent from this book, and he feels absent from developing as a character, whereas Percy develops so much that the ending felt lackluster to me, which is really my huge critique. I loved it until the ending felt like it had just been tacked on. I spent the whole book going, I want to know more, and it didn't deliver on that for me. Then the final book I finished this month is The Chase by Elle Kennedy. This is the first book in the Briar U series, which is a hockey romance series that follows on from the Off Campus series. I read the Off Campus series earlier this year. I enjoyed it. Do I think Elle Kennedy is the best writer in the world? Not necessarily. I don't think it's the most complex writing. I think at times it's very surface level, but Elle Kennedy writes chemistry really, really well. This was a very fun, very fluffy, fly-through kind of read. I did read this in the same 24-hour readathon as The Grandest Game and Glorious Rivals. In the execution of this as the first book as a spin-off from an original series, did something very, very well, and that is the main characters in this, which is Summer and Fitz. They are characters that we know from that original series. Fitz is a member of the hockey team, and then Summer is the sister of Dean in those original books, who we saw in Dean's book. So we aren't entering a new series just in the same setting with a complete new set of characters. We have a connection to them already, which I think is the correct entry point for this. Let's have a quick wine break before we move on to my DNF and the book I started and haven't finished yet. Just keeps the pipes ready for me to yammer on. My DNF was Intermezzo by Sally Rooney, and I know people are going to hate me for this. I'm not a Sally Rooney girl. I read Normal People back in 2020, 2021. I gave it 2 stars. I couldn't get through Intermezzo. This is kind of what I mean by Litfic trying to call on the greats a little bit too much. We tried stream of consciousness writing, but it felt very stunted, and it felt like as a reader we didn't have the context to make that stunted stream of consciousness make sense in how it was being depicted, and we weren't getting enough development or plot for that to aid in any capacity. I don't mind introspective narratives, and I don't mind character studies, which is essentially what this is, but the style of writing I did not get on with. I know people say you get past the no speech mark thing. I didn't. Not in this one, not in Normal People. I thought giving Sally Rooney a little bit more of a chance, now that I've completed a literature degree, I've read more diversity than I had when I read Normal People, might mean that I connected a little bit more to it and enjoyed it a little bit more. I didn't. I couldn't get into it. I had to DNF it, and I just think maybe I'm not a Sally Rooney reader. And I think that's okay. On the other end of things, the book I've started but will finish in August now is The Wedding People. I knew nothing about this going in. I thought this was a romance happening at a wedding, and I think there are elements of that in there, but this is a really, really interesting book. I'm about halfway through it currently, and the commentary so far from Phoebe, our female main character who this focuses on meaning, on kind of the meaning of life and introspection and searching for fulfillment and settling as well. I think settling is a big theme of this. Also depicting female relationships and female friendships without filters, where you can push and pull and appreciate each other for it. I don't know how this is going to end, but I can already tell it's going to break me, because although this is quite introspective and in some ways, I guess some people would consider it almost a dense writing style, it flows really beautifully for me, and it's really, really engaging. I'm enjoying this writer so much, and I can actually anticipating this potentially being a 5-star read for me. We did it! We got through all of the books I read in July. That was a very long ordeal, but I'm proud of us for doing it. Let me know if you've read any of these books, or based on any of these books I've talked about and said I enjoyed, if you have any recommendations, I would love to hear about them down below. I'd also love to chat about any of these books down below. I'm going to work on trying to put together some kind of Amazon list where I can list these books for you. I'm not entirely sure how well that's going to go, but if I succeed, it will be down in the description box below. And there will definitely be some reading vlogs featuring me reading these books coming your way very, very soon. So keep your eye out for those if you want to know my thoughts a little bit more in depth as I read. But thank you for sticking around. I know I ramble a lot. I really, really appreciate it. And happy reading for August.